video, I'm going to be talking about classical conditioning, otherwise known as learning by association. Conditioning refers to any process that results in a new behaviour or response being learned. This can be the result of deliberate training or merely an experience that ends up triggering a particular behaviour. In the case of classical conditioning, this process is often a natural one that doesn't require any particular interference or manipulation. While it can be caused deliberately, our conditioned responses are often merely the result of two stimuli being repeatedly associated with each other. We're going to refer a lot to this idea of a stimulus, and what this basically means is any object, person, or event that is able to elicit a response from us. We are always encountering different stimulus. This can be the people in our lives, or the food we eat, or places, or smells, absolutely anything at all that we might respond to. Classical conditioning is also based around the idea of innate behaviour, that some of our responses are instinctual. The example I gave in the previous video was of a dog salivating when presented with their food. This is not something that they've learned, but rather an innate instinctual response to the stimulus. We refer to something like this as an unconditioned response. A man named Ivan Pavlov, a scientist who was studying the digestive system of dogs, is credited with inadvertently discovering the idea of learning by association in one of his experiments. He was studying saliva as it related to the digestive process, but he began noticing that the dogs would start to salivate just when he entered the room, knowing food was coming, even if they didn't see it. So he decided to put this to the test. We're going to have a look at Pavlov's dogs a little closer now, as explained by our old friend Philip Zimbardo, who will tell us what they found out and how it relates to this idea of classical conditioning.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work and the work of those who followed him led to a remarkable conclusion. And that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
So what Pavlov's dog's experiment demonstrated was the idea that 2 different stimulus can be very closely associated and eventually produce this conditioned response. So we learn because 2 things are closely associated. So first of all, we have our unconditioned response that already exists as a response to an unconditioned stimulus. The dog salivating as food is presented is the unconditioned response. Then the unconditioned stimulus, the food, is paired repeatedly with a new stimulus, generally a neutral stimulus that isn't going to produce a response ordinarily. And that becomes the conditioned stimulus. The bell is rung whenever the food is served. A conditioned response now occurs in response to the conditioned stimulus. The dog now salivates when a bell is rung. And if the 2 stimuli continue to be associated, the conditioned response will be strengthened. If the conditioned stimulus isn't always paired with the unconditioned response, the conditioned response will stop or become extinct. If the bell's rung without the food being presented often enough, the dog will stop salivating when it is rung. The learning depends on the 2 events being close together in time, contiguity, and it appearing that one depends on or is the result of the other, contingency. So to break that down, we start with our unconditioned stimulus that produces an unconditioned response. We then pair that unconditioned stimulus with a neutral response, and we continue to respond to that unconditioned stimulus. And with that repeated pairing, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus and now produces a conditioned response. So now let's look at some examples. Say you have to go to the doctors regularly to get a particular treatment, and the treatment makes you feel really disgusting and gross. Outside the front of the doctor's surgery are planted a particular kind of flower. After repeated associations, you may start to feel sick and gross and nauseous when you just see that flower. Or say you have a really positive, happy response to pizza, and your pizza usually arrives in the form of the Domino's delivery truck. Maybe you will eventually feel happy and awesome and smiley just when you see the Domino's truck.